What's happening, everybody? Welcome to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. Thank you so much for joining me today. We actually have some Packers news to discuss. It's not necessarily big news. It's not necessarily great news, but we actually have some news to discuss, and that is Lane Taylor, Packers guard, signed with the Houston Texans on Thursday, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. Now, the Packers certainly were basically without Lane Taylor almost all of the last two seasons anyway, so the amount of loss here is definitely minimal. When you look at their two NFC championship teams, they didn't get a ton of investment in those two teams out of Lane Taylor, and I can certainly understand why Green Bay maybe was hesitant to bring somebody back that is coming off of back-to-back injury seasons, and this is a player who is past their 30s, isn't exactly a core member of your team. I definitely expected going into this offseason that Green Bay would try to get him back on a vet minimum deal. To me, it made more sense for Lane Taylor to be in Green Bay than anywhere else. Certainly familiar with the players around him. You have to think that he's at least, I know he didn't get to play the last two seasons, but you got to think that he knows the playbook and pretty much the entire gist of Matt LaFleur's system at this point. And to be honest, in training camp last year and through the first half of the game that he actually played in, looked really, really good going back to his natural right guard position that he played prior to joining the NFL. So I just thought that this was not a foregone conclusion, but a very likely scenario that Lane Taylor would end up back in Green Bay. But that was obviously not meant to be the case. And again, not super surprised that Green Bay would want to move on from Taylor based on the injuries, the age, everything like that. But he ultimately ends up with the Houston Texans. It's a good landing spot for him overall. Now, I want to look this up, but I think Houston has signed as many free agents as the rest of the NFL combined. I'm being somewhat hyperbolic there, but they've signed over 30 players this offseason, and it's just crazy the amount of free agent work that they've done, and not exactly made a ton of progress while doing so. But I do think that Lane Taylor is a low risk signing who can definitely be whether it's a starting member of your offensive line or certainly one of those players off the bench that helps you out. I like this signing for Houston. I'm in a way, I guess, bummed to see Lane Taylor go. He was just kind of one of those consummate professionals that you enjoyed, he's always good on Twitter, everything like that. So we'll definitely miss Lane Taylor, but he will go on to Houston and we'll see what he's able to accomplish there. This does definitely kind of lead me into my main topic for today. And as we look at the team today, I think we can sort of make some somewhat assumptions as to some players who have received at least a little bit of a vote of confidence up until this point. Now, I want to be clear here. There is a lot of offseason left. When I start going through this list, a lot of things can change through the draft, undrafted free agency, and then signing players after the draft to fill in some holes that maybe you weren't able to address via the draft. So let me give you an example here. I might say that as we sit here today, the fact that Green Bay hasn't done anything at inside linebacker is a vote of confidence for Kamal Martin and Chris Barnes, right? Well, that sounds all good and great, but if we get to the draft and all of a sudden they spend their first round pick on Zaven Collins, and their second round pick on Nick Bolton, which isn't going to happen, but let's say it did. Well, guess what? They didn't probably feel so great about Chris Barnes and Kamal Martin, right? So this can change very quickly through the remainder of this offseason. But as we sit here today on Friday, April 16th, I think we can say that some players have to feel pretty good about their position on the team, at least better than they did probably going into the offseason, where they were potentially sitting on pins and needles wondering if maybe they'd be back with Green Bay, if they were going to get some serious competition via free agency. But let's kind of go through that list and kind of see. So let's start off with, kind of based off of my Lane Taylor discussion. Lane Taylor is now gone, right? Corey Linsley, we know, is gone. Rick Wagner is gone. A huge piece of that Packers NFC Championship run a season ago was their depth along the offensive line. And to me, the fact that all three of those players have gone and they've done nothing to address the position definitely lends me to believe that they feel really good about some of their younger offensive linemen. And number one on my list here is John Runyon Jr. And this probably isn't, a super surprising name to anyone, but right now, John Runyon Jr., unless things change drastically, is a given starter along the Packers offensive line. And whether David Bakhtiari is healthy or not, you got to think that he is in the, leading the pack for that fifth offensive line position. And if David Bakhtiari is hurt to start the season, John Runyon Jr., as we sit today, is the de facto number 4 offensive lineman on this team. With David Bakhtiari out, you've got Elton Jenkins, Billy Turner, Lucas Patrick, and then John Runyon Jr. is your 4th best. And no matter what happens, let's even say they go offensive lineman 1st and 2nd round in the draft, right? Even if that happens, and you start filling out that offensive line, John Runyon Jr. is still going to be either a starter or one of the key depth pieces that they count on to fill in for minutes across the offensive line this season. So he has definitely received an upgrade in his status this offseason, and more likely than not, a significant upgrade probably into a starting role. And I think a lot of people are just saying, well, yeah, but we saw flashes of that last year, Andy. And, when he played and when he had to get in games, he looked good. And yes, that's true. I don't think he was quite as good as maybe people remember. If you're not watching offensive line directly, what you're hoping for is that you don't hear his name often, right? And you didn't. Frankly, you did not. And that is a great sign for a 6th round pick offensive lineman. We have seen games where, and I don't need to name names, you know the names. Maybe I'll name one: Jason Spriggs, Justin McCray, Byron Bell. Okay, I'll name a lot. Kyle Murphy. I could go on. We've seen games, Alex Light. All right, I'm done, I promise. We've seen some games where offensive linemen have come in, Don Barclay, and they have not been able to really continue and consistently play the way that a starter did. And you immediately notice them, right? It is just a turnstile along the offensive line, and everything changes. That wasn't the case with John Runyon Jr. That is 1,000,000% correct. And that is, again, a great sign. But he was far from perfect. And he definitely had some rookie moments. And there's definitely times where he looked overwhelmed. I'm with you in the fact that I agreed that he was ready to take the next step as to at least one of the key depth pieces and maybe a true starter along that offensive line. That doesn't necessarily surprise me, but it does surprise me that if he all of a sudden elevates up to your 4th best offensive lineman, or 5th with David Bakhtiari there, however you want to look at it, that's still a pretty big jump. And then the depth behind him is still a major question mark, right? But overall, it certainly seems that Green Bay feels very confident in some of the younger offensive linemen. And maybe that includes Simon Stepaniak and Yash Nijman, Ben Braden. Maybe that includes some of those players. But I definitely think that what they've done, or at least maybe a lack of what they've done along the offensive line, has to at least spell that they feel very confident in John Runyon Jr. moving forward. Next up on my list, and I don't think you can make any bones about this one, you can be upset with how they've done it, but I think you have to agree with my take here. Kevin King, and to an extent Chandon Sullivan, received a pretty big vote of confidence this offseason. And this one's one that's not necessarily changing, right? Kevin King got a $5 million deal. And when I posted that on Twitter the other day, a lot of people seemed under the impression that it was a very incentive-laden deal. It is not. It is a true 4.9, etc. $million deal, basically 1 year, $5 million deal that will pay him $5 million for playing this season. That is a big time deal. That is more money on a per year basis than Desmond Trufant, Quentin Dunbar, Sidney Jones, Malcolm Butler, Troy Hill, AJ Bouye, Xavier Rhodes. That's more money per season than any of those players got. Green Bay very much obviously thinks that Kevin King is a good starting caliber corner, or they're not offering him a 1 year, $5 million deal. And maybe they overpaid. Maybe that was a mistake. That's certainly that can be your prerogative. I'm not going to certainly argue with it, but they obviously feel very confident in him. And that has to be a major vote of confidence in Kevin King. Now, maybe Kevin King was going into last season, was hoping for a big lucrative long-term deal. It was very clear that once free agency started that wasn't going to happen. But I still think that if you're Kevin King, you have to take this as a vote of confidence. And to a lesser extent, Chandon Sullivan, he was the one restricted free agent that they brought back and felt really confident about and gave him that $2.1 million deal. And you want to compare players again, Desmond King, who signed also with the Houston Texans, gets $3 million, $3.1 million. Chandon Sullivan got 2.1. That's only a $1 million difference for one season. So Green Bay obviously felt very good about Chandon Sullivan to offer him $2.1 million for this season. That may not seem a lot, but like Justin Coleman, I believe, who was with Detroit as a top paid, nickel corner, goes, I have to look it up, but I'm almost positive he got less than that on the open market this season. So there were options out there, and Green Bay decided to pay the $2 million for Chandon Sullivan, and again, give him a vote of confidence going into this year. I think both of those guys have to feel pretty good about things, considering what direction Green Bay could have gone in. Number 3 on my list is Vernon Scott. One of the players that Green Bay on their restricted list did not bring back was Raven Green. And right now, Green Bay's safety depth chart is Darnell Savage, Adrian Amos, and then, question marks to an extent. Vernon Scott, Henry Black certainly lead that next group. But you have to think that Green Bay feels pretty good about Vernon Scott if right now he's probably your third safety and probably the leader in the clubhouse to play that dime safety role. Whether it's a hybrid, safety linebacker, or we even saw last year Amos move up and Vernon Scott get some time at safety. So I think just based on the lack of movement, Raven Green being gone for the time being, and again, maybe they attack safety in the draft. Maybe Raven Green is signed tomorrow. By the time you've listened to this, who knows? That would seem fitting. But as we sit here right now, it certainly seems like this has been a vote of confidence again for Vernon Scott. Next up, and I'm hesitant to say this one to some extent because we could still see a June 1st cut here, especially if Green Bay attacks the position aggressively in the draft. But right now, Dean Lowry was a player where a lot of people, myself included, thought that he would be released at some point this offseason. And some people are pointing to, well, they're waiting for June 1st. They can release him now with a June 1st designation. You might say, well, Andy, they can't use that money until June 1st anyway. That's true, but they're not going out and signing any big free agents right now anyway. They don't need that money to go out and sign anyone. So if they wanted to cut him past June 1st, they would just cut him now and with a June 1st designation. It's very, very within the realm of possibility that if they drafted a couple defensive linemen really early in the draft, that maybe they feel better about the position and decide to save the money on Lowry. It could still happen, but again, as we sit here today, it certainly seems like Dean Lowry has a spot on this team. And until proven differently, again, based on the direction that Green Bay could have gone, that's a pretty big vote of confidence that not only is Lowry on the team, but probably a projected starter amongst the defensive linemen again. And then last but not least, I alluded to this earlier, Chris Barnes and Kamal Martin. Green Bay releases Christian Kirksey and adds no players to the position. Ty Summers is still there. Oren Burks is still there. But this very much seems like the two in the front of the line are Kamal Martin and then most importantly, Chris Barnes. Again, Green Bay could attack it via the draft. They could look for veteran players after the draft. But as we talk today, it definitely seems like Green Bay feels comfortable moving forward with Kamal Martin and Chris Barnes. I really like Chris Barnes. I'm high in his potential. I don't think he's ever going to be a Pro Bowl caliber player, but I think he can be a good defender in the middle of that defense. And I think at that position, you can get away with a Chris Barnes. And you might say, hey, I don't want to get away with inside linebackers anymore. I want physical, intense, sideline to sideline linebackers that can impact the game. I'm with you. I agree. But it certainly seems like Green Bay is not valuing that inside linebacker position. And to an extent, if you had to say, hey, they're going to either value defensive line, corner, edge, safety, or linebacker on defense of the five positions, linebacker's probably fifth on my list as well. So I get it. I would love somebody there that was a high-end player. But if they had the choice between adding a high-end player at that or any of the other positions on defense, give me any of the other positions. So I agree mostly with the philosophy, but I do think Chris Barnes can be a good player at that position, and I can see why Green Bay wouldn't attack that position early and often in the draft if they do, in fact, believe in him moving forward. And again, Kamal Martin can be on that list as well. That's going to do it for me. Thanks so much for joining me today. Of course, I'll be right back here tomorrow. Until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.